Hello everybody and welcome back to the Creature Flesh Workshop and part 4 of our making a silicone mask inspired by The Last of Us. Now in the last 3 parts of this series we've been sculpting our mask. We've been using our primary forms, secondary forms, fine detailing, and we are done with that part of the process. And if you haven't seen those videos yet, please go back and check those out. But now we have to do the next big step in our process of making a silicone mask, and that is to create a mold of our sculpture. So we're going to be creating a 2-part mold to keep it simple, and that's going to allow us to reproduce our clay sculpture in silicone over and over again. Now I know I said I was done with the sculpt, but there are a few little tweaks that I want to do to it, a few more finer details before we capture it forever in our resin mold. So let's get into that. So first things first, we need to map out this seam line on our sculpt. So this is going to be a 2-part mold, so we're going to have one piece on the front, one piece on the back, and they're going to fit together, so then we can pour our silicone in and make our masks. So I need to figure out where the kind of halfway point is on my sculpt. Now it's going to be different for every sculpt that's done, depending on the design of it, whether it's got ears or horns or whatever. But what we want to try and avoid is any sort of undercuts. So that means anything that when we demold is going to make it really difficult to pull that mold apart. So we need to make sure that we've got a good halfway point around our sculpt that's going to relatively easily pull apart when we demold. It's not so bad when we demold it with the clay, but if there's too many undercuts, when we demold the silicone, it's going to rip and tear it. So I'm just going to grab a Sharpie and just mark up the line. And this is just a rough guide. I don't have to stick directly to this line, but it gives me a good idea when we lay it down of where I need to put my clay wall. So now we've got our line set up, we can now lay this guy down and start building up that wall. Now I'm going to build this wall up with clay, so we can get really tight and close up to our sculpt and have a nice clean line where those two parts of the mold meet, so we can have as little leakage as possible when we pour in that silicone. But so I don't have to use a ton of clay, I'm going to use some bits of polystyrene to lay next to my sculpt, so I can kind of build that wall up a little bit more, and then I can place the clay on top of that and build a thinner clay wall around. It saves me time and it saves me using all of my clay. Now we've got the base of the wall all set up, we can now start to slice some of our clay up and start building up that clay wall around our piece. So our clay wall is nicely roughed out. We've just gone up to the edges of our sculpt, just here, and it looks a little bit rough at the moment, but now what we need to do is smooth it out. And to do that, we are going to use one of these, which is basically just a piece of metal with some little notches cut out on it. And that means we can rake our clay to make it nice and smooth. Then we can hit it with this, which is basically just the same thing, but it's smooth. And that's going to allow us to really smooth that out. And then we're going to finish it off with going over it with a sponge to make it really, really smooth. So let's do that. Now we've got a nice smooth surface, I need to get right up to the edge of our sculpt. And that's where I'm going to have to stop using these tools because they're just way too rigid and sharp and I could damage my sculpt. So instead, I'm going to go back to using one of these little guys which we've seen before when I was sculpting, because this is a nice soft tip. We're not going to damage that sculpt at all. So I'm going to pull away some of that clay, the air drying clay, away from our oil-based clay, so we can have the straightest line possible when we put the two molds back together. Now we've got a nice smooth wall around our piece and we've gone right up to those edges and made the straightest possible line we can. We now need to make some registration keys. And these are basically like these little things on our armature. They're just going to allow our mold to fit together nicely and make sure that there's no movement in that mold when we put those two pieces together. So we've now got a nice clay wall around our sculpt. And that's pretty much it for that part of the process. But now what we need to do is seal that clay. Because clay is porous, we don't want that to soak up the resin when we put it on the top. So we're going to seal that with some clear coat, and then we're going to spray a releasing agent, some of this stuff, all over the mask and over the wall. So then that's going to make it much easier when we come to demold. It's hopefully, fingers crossed, not going to get too stuck in that mold and break the mold or break the core itself. This is also probably the scariest part of the process. We put the time and effort into sculpting this. The last thing we want is for the mold to fail, because then it's all been pretty pointless. But hey, I'm sure it'll be fine. Okay, so we're going to prime this wall first. Okay, now that's nice and dry, we're going to add some of our mold release all over. Okay, we'll let that dry for about 30 minutes and then we can put our gel coat on. So the first layer that we're going to add is our gel coat or our print coat, and arguably this is probably the most important layer because this is going to be the one that's going to capture all of that detail that we spent so long creating. Now we're going to be using Shell Shock, which is a brushable urethane plastic. It's pretty easy to use. It does have a very short pot life, which means that you don't have a great deal of time to work with it. So we're going to be mixing it up in small batches, just doing relatively small areas on our piece, because we definitely don't want to waste any of the material. We're going to be brushing it on with these little disposable chip brushes. And for the initial kind of gel print coat, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be stippling it on, making sure that not only do we get into all of those cracks and crevices and wrinkles, but we also get rid of as many bubbles as we can, because any imperfections in our mold is going to show up in our final casting when we cast in silicone. So I'm going to mix some of this up. We're going to start laying it down onto our sculpture. So our initial layer is now done. It's nicely cured, and it's now ready for our next layer, which is going to be the fiberglass layer. Now that's going to give our mold a lot of strength, it's going to stop it from warping, and it's going to ensure that when we open up that mold, that it's not going to break. But before I do the next layer, I just want to talk about some of the stuff that I did on this initial print coat layer. So we've got a good coverage over the whole of our piece, but you'll notice here I used a polyfiber, or cabasil as you might have heard it before, to thicken up our resin so I could then make a paste. And that allowed me to fill some of the deeper areas of our sculpt. And that's going to make it much easier when we apply our fiberglass layer, because I'm not going to have to push that fiberglass into those crevices. And the reason I made the wall is so I could fill this little bit here to make almost like a little cavity that I could then fill with that resin. And that's given me a nice solid piece here, because this bit is going to be in contact with the negative, so we want to make sure that's nice and strong. You'll also notice over here I added in some screws. And the reason I did that is because this part of the resin that has contact with the core is probably the thinnest part, and that's the bit that's most likely to snap off when we demold it. So what we've done is we've put some of these screws in here, almost like rebar in concrete, just to make sure that it's reinforced, so when we demold it, it's much less likely to snap off. So that's just a little insight into some of the stuff that we did to reinforce that initial coat. Now we need to hit it with some fiberglass. So we're done with the front part of our mould. It's been curing for a few days now, so we're ready to flip it over, get all of that clay and all of those pieces of foam off, so we can then start with the back piece. Okay, now we've got the worst of the clay off. We need to go in there with a little bit of water, a sponge and a little brush to get all of the clay off the wall and also the clay off our sculpt, so we don't have any imperfections when we come to putting our print coat on this side. So our mold wall is all nice and clean and free from clay. So the next step is to make some pry points. With a little bit of polymer clay, we're going to add some points around the mold wall to allow us to demold it easily by getting some screwdrivers in there and prying it apart without breaking the wall. And then we just need to rinse and repeat everything that we did on the front on the back. But it should be a little bit more straightforward this time because it's a much simpler design on the back of our mask. So our mold is finally done. And it's taken me well over a week to actually get this done, because each layer of resin that we put on, we have to wait for that to cure enough to put the next layer on, so the whole thing cures fully. We've drilled bolt holes all around the edge, so once we've taken it apart, we can put it back together and bolt it nice and tight so none of our silicone leaks out of the edge. And I've angle grinded all of that rough edge off to make it easier for us to get to that edge and pry it apart. The only thing left to do is to get it open. That's the end of part 4. Please join us again next time, where we will open up that mold and see if it actually works. But as always, thanks for joining us. We'll see you on the next one.